So I'm getting the nuclear weapon question again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this video and I'm going to put it in a folder called nuclear weapon question. So whenever you have questions about nuclear weapons, you can just click here, because I keep remaking a version of this video for people. And sometimes it's the same people asking the question about nuclear weapons as whatever Putin's policy changes. But I'm going to talk about nuclear weapons from Russia again, and then I'll make it easily accessible for everyone going forward. So what does Russia have? In Russia's stockpile, they have about 4,477 warheads. Of these, 1,500 or so are strategic warheads, and they're deployed on ballistic missiles at heavy bomber bases. 977 are strategic warheads, which are like 800 kiloton. 1,912 are non-strategic and are held in reserves. They do have tactical nuclear weapons, which include small, up to 150 kiloton weapons. As of February 23rd, some of Russia's delivery vehicles are deployed near the Ukrainian border, but they are dual capable missiles, so they're launching conventional missiles right now, not nuclear missiles, obviously, or we would have heard about it. So that means that Russia has the capability to launch nuclear weapons here into Ukraine, but hasn't done so, obviously. Now, Russia's largest current nuclear warhead is an 800 kiloton warhead that sits on top of their missiles. They can put 10 of them on a Sarmat-2 missile. Incidentally, the U.S.'s largest warhead is a gravity bomb with a 1.2 megaton yield. So let's look at the devastation from an 800 kiloton nuclear weapon on New York using NukeMap. So as you saw, it was about a 20 kilometer or 12 mile depth diameter in that blast area. But Russia wouldn't use an 800 kiloton missile or warhead. Instead, they would use a smaller tactical nuclear weapon or a smaller yielded weapon, launched likely from a submarine in the Black Sea. These are smaller missiles that would be therefore not misconstrued to be of strategic nature, aimed at the US, UK, France, who could perceive it as a ground-based launch as a strategic launch from the Russian mainland, which would risk a massive retaliation because you only get about 30 minutes to respond. Now, like I said before, these submarine-launched ballistic missiles have a yield of about 150 kilotons, and they would launch them from submarines. This is what it would look like launching a missile of that size and it hitting Kyiv. So as you saw, it had about a 10 kilometer or about a 6 mile depth diameter. Now, zooming out to include Kharkiv, you can see that it's relatively small compared to the vast size of the Ukrainian country. Now, because of this small size, one nuclear weapon would likely change very little for the Russian military or the Ukrainian military on ground in the fight. Could change some command and control, could actually kill the president and his cabinet, but the fighting would continue. There would be a lot of changes geopolitically, nonetheless. But before we go on, for funsies, here's the largest U.S. Nuclear weapon hitting Moscow. So you can see there was a depth diameter of about 26 kilometers or about 16 miles. Now this brings up the question of whether these nuclear weapons will actually work, and I'm not sure about that. Russia reportedly has been conducting a modernization program for the last decade, but I'm not sure if that's really happened or if it's like the rest of their weapons, which is utter shit. So where would they strike and why would they strike? Now Russia would likely hit an unpopulated area, or possibly even just in the Black Sea, or maybe a military target, and attempt to tell the world to back off or to force Ukraine to capitulate. What is clear is the use of such a weapon would run counter to Russia's nuclear doctrine, because Russia is not facing an existential threat. And what the more likely scenario is, the Putin regime themselves would be facing an existential threat, so Putin would want to use a nuclear weapon to maintain power himself. Such a possibility can't really be dismissed. Russia has an abundant store of nuclear weapons, and Putin might be desperate enough to use them. Because he has already done some really stupid things up to this point, no one can really say for sure if he just won't do yet another stupid thing. The possibility is not negligible, and that is worrying enough by itself. Plus, he has sanctioned other war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine, to include rape and murder of civilians, as well as targeting the civilian infrastructure. Now, to act this way obviously would be taboo, running counter to his own comments, as he would be the first country to use nuclear weapons since the United States used them in Japan, and since all the treaties came online. President Joe Biden spoke with Putin in June of 2021, where they both reaffirmed the comments made by Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan in 1985 that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. However, many taboos have been broken during this war. Now, this also brings into question as to whether he would use chemical or biological weapons. He might, and he might actually use those instead of nuclear weapons, because even though they're classified in the same realm as a weapon of mass destruction, there's less of a taboo around chemical and biological weapons. If you remember, President Obama had his red lines or his lines in the sand that were being crossed by Assad over and over again as he used chemical weapons on his own people. Now, what would the response be? Nowhere in the world would anyone be more disappointed in Russia than probably the Russians themselves. I fully believe that the Russian people would come online a little more if their country used nuclear weapons. But that would be down the road a little bit, as they probably would try to determine what the situation would be. Now, when this happens, let's say a nuclear weapon takes place, the rest of the world would clearly look to the U.S. for guidance on the response. What is clear is that the U.S., UK, France, etc., the more advanced nations would be able to detect the blasts nearly immediately due to our space-based detection systems. Now, mind you, this whole scenario of what our response is complete speculation on my part, and what the Biden administration might do may run counter to what my best guess of what would happen. Now, former U.S. Army Europe Commander General Ben Hodges and I both believe that the U.S. would respond by attacking the launch site, which in this case would probably come from the Black Sea submarine. This would mean sinking the submarine that launched the nuclear weapon or destroying the Black Sea fleet in its entirety. At which point the ball is in Russia's court to declare war against the United States and NATO, a fight that they most certainly cannot win in any way, shape, or form, and they know that. Now, the U.S. would not retaliate with nuclear weapons, as it does not need nuclear weapons to defeat Russia. Now, there is potential that the U.S. would not strike Russia's military in order to maintain its status as a non-combatant in this fight and to take the absolute high ground. But what it could do is use its most powerful weapon in the U.S. arsenal, and that's its economic might. Almost certainly, the U.S. would demand an immediate cutoff of all trade and probably travel with Russia. The EU would almost certainly follow, because they would be on the same page in their want to take action against such an atrocity, but also for fear of drawing the U.S.'s ire in this situation. Same with China. Not only would countries like China and India immediately try to distance themselves from such an action, they would not want to elicit secondary sanctions from the U.S. and the EU. Remember, China does $1.3 trillion in trade with the U.S. and the European Union, and only $50 billion with Russia. Russia would immediately be cut off from everything that they can't make by themselves, and that's actually very little. They can't even really make tractors. Like, we saw a video where they just learned how to make fucking milk cartons. The U.S. would also likely block shipping access into Russia through the Black Sea and through the Baltic Sea, forcing them to have to go north, which is virtually impossible in the winter. The U.S. and Japan would likely lock them in on the Pacific side, daring Russia to do something. A full export and import and travel ban on Russia would destroy their country within a year, internally. Arguably, their only trading partners might be North Korea, Belarus, and maybe Iran. This also doesn't even take into account the response from its own people, like I said before, as they deal with the realization that their government used nuclear weapons on a non-nuclear country. Will the Kremlin do it again? Will the West retaliate? Those are questions they'll have to ask themselves in the 21st century here. Well, the other questions that will come up eventually is, will I have something to eat, as the entirety of Russia will be isolated? The Belarusians may actually take a harsher view of Lukashenko and his support of Putin. Using nuclear weapons is so taboo that even countries that are tacitly supporting Russia likely will back off, especially in the face of the U.S. saying, back the fuck off now, we're being very serious about this. So that's kind of where I think it could go. And yeah, I'll save this somewhere so people can refer to it every time they have a nuclear question from me.